do. Okay, we are live. Welcome to Boston Basic Income. I'm Alex Howlett.
I'm Derek Van Gorder.
This week's topic is net worth economy. So what does that mean? Well, we have Chris Rimmer here to talk about it. He's developed a framework for understanding how the economy works by looking at how much wealth people have accumulated or how much they owed other people. And normally when we think about how the economy works, we think about the economy providing a benefit over time. So that's kind of a flow. You're getting to eat every day because the economy is producing food for you every day. But at the same time this is happening, people are getting richer and richer, or some people are getting poorer, right? Or some people are going further and further into debt. So that has to do with how wealthy you are, or what your net worth is, your assets minus liabilities. So Chris has developed a really cool pictorial notation for describing changes to balance sheets, changes to people's assets and liabilities, the creation of debt and repayment, and just transferring even actual stuff, actual goods like an apple, back and forth between people. And I found that notation to be very helpful, especially when I'm thinking about balance sheets and when I'm thinking about who owes what to who. I think it's a really neat thing. You can't see it if you're listening on the podcast, but we'll include links to some of the diagrams and the papers that Chris has shared with us in the show notes. So something else interesting that Chris's framework does is it doesn't put a price on individual goods and services. It kind of keeps them separate. So if you have a lot of apples, you don't have, in real life, obviously you could put a price on them. You might have $100 worth of apples, but you might just, in Chris's model, he doesn't do that. He just says you have 100 apples. That way, if the price changes, what's on your balance sheet still stays the same in Chris's model. So the idea is that instead of just narrowing down people's wealth or boiling it down to one single monetary number, you have kind of a list or a vector of each of the different things that people own, each of the different things that people owe, and how much of them there are. So when Chris talks about net wealth, he's not talking about netting out everything into a single number. He's talking about netting out assets and liabilities, so that you have this vector of net values for each different type of possible asset or liability that you could hold. And then he uses that to maybe draw some insights into how the macroeconomy works. So I'm not, I've only been thinking about this since I met Chris. Derek and I met him a couple of weeks ago at a symposium. So he certainly knows more about it than I do. And I'd like to hear him describe it in his own words. So go ahead, Chris.
Okay, thanks, Alex, for that introduction, and thanks for having me on the podcast. Okay, so I'll just start off, give you a quick background, bit of my background. I studied maths and computing at university. It was a very formal and rigorous course. It was looking at, one of the things it was doing was how to prove that a particular piece of software meets the specifications. So it was very mathematical. And then I was a software developer for 15 years. And did a lot of object-oriented analysis and design, which is basically mathematical modeling of the real world. And in 2008, I saw a film called Money as Debt, a short animated film. I don't know if you've seen it, but it was very interesting. And it made a very specific claim that there's not enough money in the world for all borrowers to repay their loans and also pay the interest. So I thought that'd be an interesting thing to investigate. And I did that. I was convinced the claim was wrong after thinking about it for several months. But in the process, I realized I'd discovered a very distinctive economic model, which was very simple and it seemed very rigorous. And the key to it was net worth. So thanks for the explanation. So net worth is what you own, your tangible assets, plus the things that you're owed.
Chris, we're getting audio from both of your things. You got to mute one of them, please.
Oh,
That's
okay.
interesting. I didn't hear that, Alex.
Oh.
Yeah, I haven't got a microphone on my PC. Is it still a problem?
Oh, no, it's my end. It's my problem.
Okay. Shall I go on then? Yeah, okay. Right, so your net worth is what you own, your tangible assets, plus what's owed to you, your debt assets, minus the things you owe to other people, your liabilities. And so that's one way of thinking about it is it's what you'd be left with if everyone paid their debts. And another way of thinking about it is it's your share of the world's net worth. And a third way of thinking about it is it's your savings. It's what you've got that you can consume if you don't produce any more for the rest of your life. It's what's left, or what you have sort of, it's what you effectively what you've produced more than you've consumed. Yeah, so a balance sheet is just a table which shows your assets, your liabilities, and your net worth. I call an action anything which changes anyone's balance sheet. And the interesting thing I found was that almost all actions decrease one person's net worth and increase another person's net worth by exactly the same amount. What I found was the trick to understanding the economy is to look at actions from the point of view of an asset or a liability rather than from the point of view of a person. So if I just share my screen for a second, I'll try to show what I mean by that. So, as you said, I use apples quite a lot in my examples. So here's the lifetime of an apple. So can you see the cursor there? Yeah. On the left, this arrow, so if you can't see this, then just imagine a line of people. There's a farmer, then a wholesaler, then a retailer, then a customer. And the first thing that happens to this apple is the farmer plucks it from a tree. So now he has an apple added to his net worth, and it doesn't affect anybody else's net worth. Now, next thing that happens is he passes it on to a wholesaler. And at that point, the farmer's net worth goes down by the apple and the wholesaler's goes up by the apple. Then we move on to the retailer. So again, the wholesaler's net worth goes down by an apple, retailer's goes up by an apple. Then it gets passed to the customer. Same thing happens again. And then finally, the customer eats the apple, and the customer's net worth goes down by one apple, but nobody's net worth goes up by one apple. So what you have is, so the producer does some work to introduce some new net worth into the economy. That's the production here. Then the net worth passes down a chain of people, temporarily increasing one person's net worth at a time. And then finally, the consumer removes it from the economy and usually gets some benefits in the process. So he gets a nice apple to eat.
So maybe one way of putting it would be that the apple represents a certain amount of wealth. When it's produced, the wealth is created, and then people pass it around, and ultimately someone eats the apple, and then the wealth is destroyed at that point.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, perfect. Okay, so the producer does the work and the consumer gets a benefit. So why does the producer pass on the product? And the answer is he gets something in return. So let's have a look at this. Here's the lifetime of a coin. So again, even though a coin lasts for a very long time, at some point it gets produced, and it goes down a very long line, and eventually it will get destroyed. So maybe it gets lost, or maybe it gets melted down to turn into jewelry or something.
Hopefully nobody's eating it.
Yeah, I hope not. But that would be a kind of consumption, I guess. Sorry, I want to say at this point, we're talking about tangible assets. So we're talking about, in this case, a precious metal coin. We're not moving on to modern coins that represent something yet. So it's just like for the apple, it's just the chain of owners much longer because it's not perishable. But what I'm going to show here is why the farmer gives the wholesaler an apple, and the answer is there's a transaction involved. We have at the same time as the farmer gives the wholesaler the apple, there's also another action taking place where the wholesaler gives the farmer this coin, and they're just different parts of these two actions appear in different chains, and there are just vast numbers of these chains throughout the economy. Every single tangible asset has its own chain from the producer to the consumer. Okay, And then now the farmer's got a coin, and maybe he'll exchange that for a pen, and that pen would have its own chain of production, distribution, and consumption. So one thing I want to say about this is in this model, it doesn't just include production for sale. It includes production for people who are going to consume things themselves. It includes gifts. It includes transfers by force or fraud or theft. And we can also say it includes services, because Jean-Baptiste Say pointed out that services can be thought of as the simultaneous production, transfer, and consumption of what he called an immaterial product. But it effectively works the same way. The producer does the work, consumer gets the benefit. So like a musical performance or something. So what we've got here is a model which can describe a complete barter economy with commodity money. And probably the most important thing is there's no fallacy of composition. So anybody's net worth is the sum of all the arrows that go into them, all the times that they've gained some net worth, minus the sum of all the arrows that have gone away from them, all the times they've given some net worth away. So it means it is a macroeconomic model, but because we're not dealing with price here, it's a macro model that works even on a very small economy as well. I'm not aware of any other macro models that work on the full range from small to big.
So you're essentially adding apples and oranges without trying to reconcile them with each other.
Absolutely, yeah, that's right.
What do you get out of doing this? I mean, if you imagine that showing this barter economy where it's all apples and oranges, trading for pens, trading for various things, that can be explained by the model. But then you also have coins here, and so typically, right, it's not just one coin being traded for an apple; it might be a number of coins. So why are you reducing? First off, how are you describing that? Are you just describing anytime money is traded as just money as a single object, as if it were any other good? Or, why wouldn't you include the quantity of monies? Why ignore the price?
What I'm trying to do is come up with a description of what's taking place, and then we can try to interpret it later on. But I think the important thing is if we can have a very precise understanding of what's going on, if we analyze it to its simplest components, and notice that the simplest component in this model is the action, not the transaction, so it's even smaller than a transaction, and then we can put it back together again. We can put all these the results of all these individual actions together just by summing them. So what it's going to let us do is analyze, say, the macroeconomic effects of individual actions, and we might talk about quantitative easing, for example, a bit later on.
So what you're saying is before we actually try to figure out why things are happening, we can have a very precise description of what is happening. So I give you an apple, that's an action. You give me a coin, that's an action. And then when we combine those in those two actions, that they go together, that's a transaction. And then the transaction implies a price. So here the price is one apple costs one coin, or one coin costs one apple. So there's a price either way, depending on which good you're pricing things in. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's accurate. I mean, there's no reason why it has to be sort of one-to-one. So it could be, the farmer's not going to pick just one apple. So he's probably going to sell 1,000 apples to the wholesaler or more. And he might get 2 gold coins for that in reality. But what's going to happen is the farmer's net worth is going to go down by 1,000 apples and up by 2 gold coins. And that explains his motivation.
Yeah, good stuff.
Okay. So do we want to move on to debts, or do you have other questions at this point?
We can, yeah, before we move on to debts, I wanted to ask about what net wealth represents, or what net worth represents in the economy. So in my introduction, I was talking about how there's this kind of flow of benefit that people are receiving by participating in the economy, and kind of that's why we have an economy. That's what it's doing. So does the accumulation of net wealth, does that represent an accumulation of inventories that allow the flows to be smoothed out? Is that the main purpose of it? Does net wealth accumulate forever under certain circumstances? Why would that happen? And maybe talk about capital. So wealth or net worth, assets that are productive in themselves. So you hold an asset, and then that's producing a flow as well. Is that I don't know? Yeah, maybe you can speak to that.
Yeah. Okay. I'll try. So what I'd say is net worth just represents. Let's say the net worth of the whole world represents everything that's ever been produced minus everything that's ever been consumed. So it's the everything that's left over. It really represents the state of the world, and it would include everything. If somebody's going to build a factory, then that's part of their net worth. And so that's why I say you can think of it as savings, and one person's net worth is their share of the world's savings. It's a little bit harder to say for an individual what their net worth represents, because it involves saving and trading and lots of other things. So it's not simply what they've produced minus what they've consumed. We also have to add the things that they've gained as gifts or in trade, and take away what they've given away in trade or had stolen from them, or just given away.
So to just follow up on that, I guess what I'm asking is, does net worth accumulate and grow and change mostly in service of how it affects the flows that are going on in the economy, or is there something about net worth itself that's valuable to look at?
I think it's. In a sense, it's something like a factory. You don't normally think in terms of a flow of factories being built and being used up and consumed. They last for a long time, or houses, or even vacuum cleaners or something. So I think it is useful to think of these things in their own right. A lot of economic analysis says that a consumer product, it will treat a durable consumer product pretty much as used up once it's bought. And I think what I'm hoping to do is treat something that is durable as being perhaps more valuable than something which gets used up very quickly.
So what you're talking about is what economists call capital. So things
that
are produced,
I think that's right. Yeah.
So the factory is a stock, is a form of wealth that produces a flow. It produces goods and services, or it contributes to producing goods and services, and that makes sense to me.
Yeah, and I think you can think of rather than thinking in terms of a flow, I normally think in terms of producers add what they've produced to a big heap, and then consumers take stuff off the heap and consume it. So if we think of that heap as being the stock of the world's net worth, that's what it represents.
Yeah, and I think you've got a great way of describing all of these balance sheet changes that I'm actually very impressed with from reading your paper. Yeah, and I think it's I guess later on we can get into questions of what this means and what we can kind of draw out of this framework that can apply to our understanding of the world or something like that. But we can go ahead and move on to debt if you want to talk about debt.
Okay, so the one thing that we haven't included for a modern economy, really the difference between that and a barter economy is there are debts. And this is a representation of a typical debt. Let's see if I can just find my notes, what I was going to say. So for anyone listening, just imagine a field, which it runs from east to west or west to east. Alice and Bob meet on the west side, and Bob promises to give Alice an apple when they meet again on the east side. And he's got a piece of paper which is perforated down the middle, half of it's green, half of it's pink. And he draws a picture of an apple on both halves of the paper, tears it down the middle, gives a green piece to Alice, and keeps the pink piece himself. And they could just walk down. Alice will walk down the north side of the field, Bob down the south side, and they could meet up at the other end. And at that point, they can put the two pieces together. Say, Bob can say, "Yes, I owe you an apple," and hand Alice the apple. So that would be what's going on here. But there's also a possibility that Alice, instead of keeping that IOU for herself, she could trade it with someone. So she just hands the green piece of paper to somebody else, will probably get something in return for it, or it could be a gift. We can also have Bob doing the same thing. So somebody else could take over, could say, "Tell you what, Bob, I'll owe that debt instead of you." And that can go down. So we've got this chain of people on the north side of the field, a chain of people on the south side. At the end, there's still one person who owes a debt to the other person, and they can pay that debt, and then the debt is considered paid, and so the debt disappears, and that's the lifetime of the debt. It got created. The debt was created first, then the debt asset half could be transferred, the liability half could be transferred, and then at the end, the debt's written off.
So you're using the term written off to mean that the debt goes away. Like, you gave me the apple, so you no longer owe me an apple.
That's right. Although I'd still use the term write-off debt, just simply means the debt doesn't exist anymore. It's the end of the life of the debt. So whether or not the apple gets paid.
Right. So the fact that we associated the apple with the writing off of the debt means we turned it into a transaction. And right now we're looking at the individual actions, is what you're saying.
That's absolutely right. Yes. So actually, you'd have. I'll tell you what. Let's look at the. Where is it? Here it is.
Let me just kind of, in my own words, tell this apple debt story. So let's say I'm an apple picker. And you want an apple, and I haven't picked my apples yet, but for whatever reason, we come to an agreement that I owe you an apple. I'm going to pick you an apple later on. And you are happy with that. But then it ends up that you don't need the apple anymore. So you take this little IOU note for an apple, and you give it to Derek. And then eventually Derek comes back to me asking for the apple. And I've picked my apples by then. I give Derek the apple, and we write off that debt. That debt is no longer outstanding anymore. So that's kind of, you can kind of transfer this IOU slip of paper. Whoever's holding it gets to kind of collect the debt. And then on the other side of it, say I've decided I'm not going to pick apples, and for whatever reason, I've made an arrangement with someone else to pick the apples for me. And I said, hey, if someone comes along with this slip of paper that says I owe you an apple, then you have to give that person an apple. So on kind of both ends, the debtor can transfer what they owe to someone else if someone else owes it instead, and then the person who holds the IOU note can pass that note to someone else, so someone else can collect it if they want to. That's basically the story you're telling, right?
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, much better than I put it. Okay, and now so let's have a look at the effect on everyone's net worth from that. So when the debt's created, this is Bob, that's Alice. So Bob's promising to pay Alice an apple in the future. Well, that's increasing Alice's net worth by one apple, because she's now got a debt asset. It's decreasing Bob's net worth by one apple, because at some point in the future, he's going to have to give away an apple and not get anything in return. Then as Alice passes this IOU down the chain, as she's transferring this debt asset, that's transferring the net worth along the chain to the final person who has it. Interestingly, when Bob passes his liability onto another person, net worth is transferred in the opposite direction, because when Bob no longer owes the apple, his net worth has actually gone up by one apple, and the person who now has the liability, their net worth goes down by one apple. And then finally, when the debt's written off, that that's a transfer of one apple of net worth from the final creditor to the final debtor. And I don't know if you noticed, but what's happening here is it's just a loop of net worth being transferred around. So over the lifetime of the debt, there's no change. Nobody's net worth changes at all. Everybody gains the value of the debt once and loses it once, which I think is actually quite important for analysing the economy. And you might ask, what's the point of all these transfers if nothing actually changes to anybody's net worth?
Well, I might ask that, yes.
and the answer is that each of these transfers, or creation of debt or write-off debt, is another way of transferring some of your net worth. So it can be used in a transaction. So that we now have, instead of one way of transferring net worth by transferring a tangible asset, we have 5 ways. You can create a debt, you can transfer a debt asset, you can write off a debt, or you can transfer a liability, or you can transfer a tangible asset. You'll find these used all the time. Transferring a debt asset is particularly common because that's what money is. Money is a debt owed by a bank to you or to the holder. When you pay something with money, you're transferring that debt asset to another person.
So basically, you're saying there are a lot of different ways you can pay people.
That's absolutely right. And when we look at the whole economy, what we find is that every single change to anybody's balance sheet exists in one of the chains of transfers of tangible assets, or one of these debt loops. And that's it. That's everything. That's the whole economy.
So either I gave you something or I went into debt to you in order to pay you.
Yeah,
is that what you're saying? Right. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, it's a let's see, you could pay me by letting me write off the debt to you. Oh, sorry, let me write off your debt to me.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So I write off what you owe me, and that's a way of paying you.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, and in fact, that's how you normally how you repay a loan at a bank, and it's a mutual write-off of debts.
And just to be clear, just to clarify for people who are listening, so when you borrow from the bank, really, the bank owes you, say, $10,000, but you also owe the bank, or you owe the bank $10,000, the $10,000 that you borrowed, but they also owe you $10,000, and that's the deposit. If you go in to the bank, you can withdraw those $10,000. So that's money that they owe you if you want to claim it. And so you both owe each other $10,000. So there's really 2 debts that are created whenever you borrow. And what Chris is saying is that the way you pay that debt back to the bank is by paying it from your deposits. So you're reducing the amount of money that they owe you, and that's how you're paying back the money that you owe them.
Yeah, that's probably the most common way. I mean, there are other ways, but yeah, that's probably the most common. And so yes, with a bank loan, you would actually have 2 of these loops. One of them will probably be a much bigger loop, the one with the money. It's less common to start transferring debts owed by you to the bank around, although it does happen.
That's what we saw with securitizing mortgage loans and leading up to the 2008 crisis and stuff like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, good example. Okay, but what I think this shows, and correct me if I'm wrong, is so we've moved from a barter economy where people produce, distribute, and consume tangible assets to an economy where people produce, distribute, and consume net worth. And fundamentally, economics isn't much more complex in a modern financialized industrial economy than it is in a barter economy. I think the biggest difference is that because we're using debts, sometimes people don't or can't keep their promises. And so sometimes debts have to be written off without the debt actually being paid. And that's sort of that's the model, really. That's my shortest introduction I could come up with, I'm afraid.
Well, that was, yeah, I'm impressed with how short it was. So I like your point about debts, what happens when debts are not able to be repaid, because obviously if you're just looking at the actions, a write-off is a write-off. But if you look at the transaction and, one side of the transaction fails, then you've got something that people didn't initially agree to happening in the economy, and that can be a problem. So in your paper, you talk about insolvency and why insolvency can be a problem. Can you say more about that? So just so insolvency is when your liabilities are greater than your assets, so your net worth is negative. So talk to us about that a little bit.
Yeah, so insolvency just means you don't have enough assets to pay all your liabilities. You've made more promises than you can actually keep. I think it's best to do this by example. So I came up with one. Imagine Alice is a tenant farmer. She's got half a ton of wheat in her granary, and Bob starts selling her beer in exchange for IOUs for her grain. And sometimes he redeems the IOUs, and every time he's always been paid. So he gains confidence, and eventually he keeps accepting IOUs up to 1 whole ton of wheat. So she's only got half a ton of wheat, but now he's got IOUs from her for a whole ton. And eventually, so she's actually insolvent now. Eventually, Bob needs to decides or needs to redeem all his IOUs. And then suddenly you have a liquidity crisis because Alice can't hide her insolvency anymore. But the underlying problem is the insolvency. It's that Alice has made promises that she doesn't have the means to keep. And it's basically the same as for a Ponzi scheme. As soon as the manager of the scheme takes any of the funds away, the fund is insolvent, and investors can't be paid even what they paid in, let alone what the big returns are promised. But it can take years or decades even for the insolvency to be noticed. But when it does get noticed, as Perry Mailing says, it kills you very quickly.
Yeah, so you brought up the idea of a liquidity crisis. So this is the idea that, liquidity, when you're illiquid, is when you have a cash commitment that you can't make in that moment, or when you have a debt that you need to be able to repay that you can't repay at that time. So I guess this leads to a couple questions. One of them is, can you have a liquidity crisis without insolvency? And then the second one is, are there times when it's normal for someone to get more and more insolvent over time, and you don't have to worry about liquidity? So the example that I'm thinking of, like the big one in my mind, is like a government running a deficit every year. Is that something that's eventually going to be a problem? Because that means they're becoming more and more insolvent every year. Their net worth is going further and further negative every year, right?
Yeah, that's right. Okay, so I address the first one first. So can you have a liquidity crisis without insolvency? I would say there doesn't have to be. If somebody genuinely has enough assets to pay all their liabilities, and all they're missing is the liquidity, then they can go to any bank and get a secured loan. And the bank, if the assets are genuinely worth what the person owes, then any bank would be happy to take a bit of interest on a guaranteed a loan, so secured by something that's obviously valuable.
So here's another question. In your particular model, you keep each type of asset as a separate element in people's net worth vector, so to speak. Is it possible to be solvent in apples, perhaps, and be very rich in apples, but be insolvent in oranges? Like you have a debt in oranges, but all you have to pay with is apples. Is that a form of insolvency?
It could be, yeah. If you owe lots of oranges, and suddenly there's a really bad frost or something, and that kills off all the oranges, then suddenly you're going to find it very difficult to exchange your apples for oranges. So you're going to find it difficult to pay your debts. So you've got to always bear in mind that prices can change, and you've got to be honest about what it is you've actually got. You've actually got apples, and you know oranges. That's always going to be, that's a kind of risk that you're taking.
So part of the reason why I'm asking this question is because you are explicitly keeping each type of thing separate in people's net worth. So you can't, if you're talking about vectors, you can't say that, you know, the magnitude of the vector. If we're talking about the net worth as like the magnitude of the vector, but if it's got, you know, elements that you can't compare, you can't really say necessarily whether someone's overall net worth is positive or negative. So it would seem like insolvency would have to be something that would be determined along each of those dimensions. Is that right?
I think what you'd have to say is insolvency is an overall state. It's a state of the whole vector, but you're not going to know. There are times where you're not going to know for sure whether you're actually solvent or insolvent until you actually try to exchange what you've got for what you owe, which is actually true with money as well.
So maybe another way of putting it is that you can't really know whether you're solvent or not until you start putting in prices. Is that accurate?
Yes, and I think I'd probably go further than that. I think I'd say you can't do this until you actually make the exchange.
Well, I might say that the prices aren't really real until you actually make the exchange anyway. So
yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. So this is a basic income podcast. Basic income is a flow of money going to people, and it's interesting to me because if you think about money constantly being added to the economy and kind of going towards purchasing the economy's production, then that money has to accumulate somewhere. So you would expect that the economy's net worth in terms of money at least would be increasingly positive. Now, if you have inflation, obviously, you know, that might be meaningless, and your prices might just be going up and up and up. But that's kind of like the flip side. So a very simple flip side of governments running perpetual deficits is just kind of handing out money to everyone. So you have this kind of mirror image there. And I don't know if you have any thoughts on basic income in particular, but what do you think about? Is there a kind of equilibrium where you know, the net worth of the economy can't keep going up, or wouldn't keep going up because people's behavior, once it gets big enough, they wouldn't keep increasing it, or is it just something that kind of can kind of keep going?
Yeah. I think what I'd say is that if you start introducing new money into the economy, you can, there's two kinds of, let's say, paper money you can have. You can either have something that's a pure fiat currency, which is just a piece of paper that says this is worth so many dollars. And I don't think you can really count that as an asset because nobody has an obligation to give you anything for it. And even if you have what's it called, legal tender laws that say that somebody must accept that money in exchange for writing off a debt, then if you take the group of people as a whole, then between them there's nothing they can exchange that money for. So
what if you have economic policies that ensure that, for example, $1 is always going to be able to buy a certain amount of gold? Because if the gold price moves, then, you know, the central bank and the government go into the market and push prices back in the other direction. Would you describe that money as being a type of asset?
I don't think I would. I'd still say that if nobody's obliged to give you gold for it, then I don't think it can count as one of these as an IOU.
Okay.
And so I think in reality it would end up just being a form of wealth redistribution rather than actually creation.
So the line you draw between what's an actual IOU and an asset is whether someone is standing there literally promising you to hand you a particular thing directly, rather than making a promise on behalf of the market or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, trying to equalize the sort of going rate of a banknote with something is, if we just looked at what was happening in the economy, maybe it's all this. It's there are debts and there are tangible assets changing hands.
Sure.
But these pieces of paper don't belong to one of those things. And
so how
the only
does your
place
model handle fiat money that is not explicitly redeemable for a specific tangible asset?
It treats it as worth one piece of paper.
Okay, but it doesn't really. It just describes it as like sometimes people want these pieces of paper, but it doesn't describe why they want them. Is that accurate?
It doesn't describe anyone. It's people want them, I suppose, just because that's what they're being forced to use for trading, but to the economy as a whole, or to all the people in it, they are not worth anything. There's nothing they can consume beyond what they produce themselves, which that money gives them. That doesn't give them the ability to consume anything more than they actually produce themselves anyway. So it doesn't add anything to their ability to consume.
What do you mean consume more than they produce themselves? Are you talking about individual people, like someone not being able to consume more than they produce?
No, I mean as a group. So if you take
As a group,
the whole economy, if you add in some extra fiat money rather than debt money, then those people have some extra piece of paper, but what they can consume from that point is just what they've saved before, plus whatever they produce in future, which is exactly the same as if they didn't have those pieces of paper.
Well, are these pieces of paper, are they relevant at all in determining what people produce in the future, what the economy produces in the future?
Yes, it could be. Yeah. It's a way of it will have an effect, certainly, but it doesn't itself. It's the production that creates wealth. It's not the introduction of new piece of paper. Is what I'd say. It's just purely the.
Would you say that the distribution of the flows of these pieces of paper, if you change that can affect the incentives to produce?
Yes, definitely. Yeah. And so I think that's something that becomes a political discussion then. Is this what we want to do? We're planning to introduce fiat money, which we hope will lead to these benefits. But what I'm insistent on is that producing those pieces of paper or putting them into the economy does not in itself add any wealth to the economy. It may encourage, it may discourage wealth from being created. And that's
it's just an action of creating something, just like the action of producing the apple produces the apple, except this time you're producing a piece of paper or even a digital whatever. It's not it doesn't promise you that's going to induce some kind of transaction of production of something else going in the other direction. Or you need to explain that separately. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, that's right. You'd have to. It's hard to see what the incentive is for the economy as a whole to produce anything extra, and even if they do, it's their production that's adding to the wealth of the economy, not the piece of paper.
So it's interesting so I think we all agree that, we can only consume what we produce collectively. Some people might be producing less than they consume. Some people might be consuming less than they produce. So I think that much is clear. And I was going to say something else, but I don't remember what it was. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I think we all agree on that. But then I think the question, I think it's notable, right, that in all of these transactions that occur, whenever someone produces, like at the very beginning, we talked about kind of the question of, well, why does the farmer produce stuff for the consumer, right? Something's got to be in it for him. And in our economy, it's always money. I mean, 99% of the time, it's money, and in fact, to the point where that good isn't going to get into the hands of the consumer unless that person has money. So I mean, I guess I don't think we disagree or anything, but I guess there is a sort of a difference of emphasis here. Like, it does seem to me pretty possible for the lack of money to be a bottleneck on the economy's production, but it doesn't sound like you would really agree with that. If you're saying that creating the money is just creating paper and it's not able to actually cause the economy to produce
is
money.
That you're not taking a position on that, Chris.
I think I'd say that that there's when money represents a debt from a bank to the holder of the money, there's very clear incentive to produce something in exchange for that form of money, because what's going to happen is the bank is going to ensure either that the borrower who helped to create that money will take some of their money and give it to the bank to write off their debt, meaning that there's now more goods and services in the market available for the person who's now got the money. Or alternatively, if the borrower defaults, then the bank itself will have to transfer some valuable assets to the holder of the money, the holder of the deposit. So it's really the bank is acting kind of like an insurer, really, for ordinary people's IOUs. It's if the person who borrows the money doesn't produce at least as much, or doesn't introduce into the market at least as much as they take out of it, then the bank will make up the difference, and that's the point of the bank's capital.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. The bank acts as kind of a credit intermediary. I might not know Chris, but I know the bank, so I'll take an IOU from the bank, even if I wouldn't take an IOU from Chris. But maybe the bank is in the business of knowing Chris and knowing everybody, so they'll take Chris's IOU because they checked his credit and everything, and then they turn around and issue an IOU to me, and I'll accept that. That makes a lot of sense to me. I remember what I was going to ask before, which is you could imagine an economy with a certain level of net worth, and it has a certain level of output, so a certain level of benefit that people are getting. But you could also imagine, at least in your model, you could have an economy with the exact same amount of net worth, but the flows are like 10 times as much or something like that. So people are able to get 10 times as much benefit from the economy. I'm wondering how you kind of factor that in. Like, you could have the same amount of net worth, but 10 times the GDP or something like that. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So I think what's important in this model is not just the level of net worth at any point in time, but it's the changes in net worth as well. So if you have a highly productive economy, then you're adding to this pile of net worth really, really quickly. So that's
so you're both adding and subtracting from it. So you have this kind of gross change in net worth that is maybe worth paying attention to.
Yes, that's right. Yes. So and that is an important feature of it. That's right. Yeah. As you say, it's a very different a different sort of economy where even if you've got the same amount of constant wealth, if your pile is the same size, but it's being added to very, very slowly, then you can only take out of it very slowly as well.
Right. Yeah.
Otherwise, eventually, if you try to take it out at a faster rate, eventually your pile will run out, and your pile will run out a lot quicker if you have a much smaller pile to start with.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense to me. So we are getting toward the end, and you had a few examples of applying this model, and I wanted to ask if you could get into those.
Yeah, sure. I'll tell you what, let's do the broken window one, because I think that's a really good one. So, you know, Bastiat's broken window parable?
Yeah, so the idea is someone breaks a window and then you're like, oh, that's good for the economy because it creates work for the guy who has to replace the window or something like that.
Yeah. So, oh, I wrote something down here, but I haven't got it. So I'll just, oh no, here we go. Yeah. So, yeah. So is it good for the economy? Well, the baker's window gets broken. So he has to go out and buy another window from the glazier. And then the glazier's got some more money and he can go off and buy a pair of shoes or something, is the idea. Is that good for the economy? Well, let's have a look at the net worth. So here's the first one. Breaking the window is consumption. He doesn't get any benefit out of it, but so it's an unfortunate form of consumption. But
so in your model, just to be clear, anytime wealth is destroyed or disposed of, that's a form of consumption. And then right, hopefully you would associate that with some kind of benefit as well, but not always.
Exactly, yeah. Okay, so let's look at the baker's net worth. Well, the baker's net worth goes down by one window. And if we look at the whole world's net worth goes down by one window as well. Okay, now let's look at the baker then buying a new window. Okay, so he gives £100 around from the UK to the glazier, and the glazier gives him a new window. So what's happened now? Well, if we look at the cumulative change, the baker's net worth is now minus £100, and the glazier's net worth has gone up by £100. But what people seem to forget is it's also gone down by one window. And if we look at the whole world again, it's still gone down by one window. There's nothing has changed that. The whole world is still worse off as a result. And no matter what happens, what sort of trading happens, the whole world will be one window worse off. Now, maybe the glazier will make a new window, but it's his production that's adding to the world's wealth then. It's not the fact that the baker's window was broken. So I think that's perhaps quite a useful insight into the broken window fallacy, as I call it.
I think that's a nice way of showing it. And I think intuitively, if you asked people, you know, are we better off if the window is broken? People will say, no, we're worse off. We have one less window in our economy or in our society. And this is just kind of like a way of spelling that out. Like, yes, your intuition is right that a broken window is bad. So the question is, why are there ways of thinking about this in which the broken window is a good thing for the economy? I don't know if you have anything to say about that, but I have some thoughts.
Well, my thinking is it's because people focus too much on the flows, that they're thinking in terms of, I think they're probably thinking in terms of in terms of transactions being a kind of, I can't think of the word here, just a representing some production that's going to take place. So the glazier probably will make another window, but it's not the fact that you know, the glazier could have put in that effort anyway, made another window, had two windows, and then sold them to two other people.
So maybe there's two different scenarios here. One in which the glazier is making all the windows he can make, and then you're taking one of those windows away to replace the new window. And then there's another scenario in which everyone has all the windows they need and the glazier isn't making any additional windows. You break some windows, now you get some business for the glazier. And I think, you know, that's kind of the intuition for why breaking a window could be good for the economy. That's that second scenario, but it's also objectively bad. Like, if we didn't need more windows, why should we be making more windows? Why do we want to create that need is kind of the question you have to ask there.
Yeah, and I think even though the glazier is, I guess you'd say, he's obviously happier having the money than having the extra window. it's very much at the baker's expense. And I think a good way of seeing that is to ask yourself, what happens if somebody smashes the baker's window and then throws the glazier's wedding cake into the bin?
Yeah, there you go. Now the glazier will have to make the new window in order to replace his wedding cake or something like that.
And the baker will have to make a wedding cake to replace the glazier's glazier's cake. So
now you've created make work essentially in the economy.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
They've had to do work, but ended up where they started.
Yeah. I would want to emphasize though in that example that like however bad we feel about the broken window, the person who's replacing it they're really benefiting. They're getting money that they're now going out and buying other resources with, which they, at least in this scenario, they wouldn't be doing otherwise. That's something that has to be like explained and looked at, I think.
So I think an important insight here is that net wealth is not just one thing. It matters where the wealth is in the economy, and it matters where the flows are flowing to and where they're flowing from. So if you have a specific person who does not have money flowing in, and therefore they cannot participate in the economy, and the only way you can get that person money, the only way you can restart his flow of money is by making up work for him to do that otherwise wouldn't be needed, then that's kind of the broken window example. That's what you're doing there, is you're making up work for someone to do that otherwise wouldn't be needed as an excuse to get money flowing to that particular person or money flowing to a particular part of the economy. So that can kind of tie into the basic income question as well. Like, where does money need to be flowing into the economy in order to activate the flow of goods and services efficiently in a way that we're not kind of making up work for people to do as an excuse to get them money, because that's really what the broken window example is. It's making up work for someone to do as an excuse to give them money.
Yeah, and it's also destructive as well. I mean, we can make up work that doesn't destroy any wealth. So, I mean, even
that's a fair.
Probably something useful people can do, like pick up rubbish or something, or that's a useful job.
Yeah, you can do it by doing something destructive and then getting people to do something productive to cancel it out, or you could just do it by getting some people to do something that's unproductive. So it kind of nets out the same way in the end, either way. If someone's digging holes and filling them back in again, that's roughly equivalent to breaking windows and making new windows, right?
Yeah, I guess. I mean, nobody's as long as they're doing it somewhere that's not actually in the road, then it's not harming anybody, I suppose.
Yeah, I guess there's a period of time there where the window's broken and you're suffering a loss from that as well.
Yeah.
I mean, you're emphasizing that the bad part is that the window's destroyed, but I think maybe what Alex is trying to emphasize is remember that even if it's something that's more innocuous, someone's building an office building for a business venture that turns out to just be vaporware, and it doesn't, meanwhile, that office is using resources, right? It's using resources that could have gone to, more windows or more bread or something else, right? So there is a cost, there can be a cost to these things, even if it's not obviously destructive, as in the broken window.
Yeah, and labor itself is a resource. Using that is a cost, right? People's time is an opportunity cost. If you're having people work on something in particular, that means they're not spending their time doing something else, that kind of thing. Yeah. Well, so we are getting to the end. Do you have any final thoughts, Chris?
I don't know. I was thinking about the paradox of thrift, wasn't I?
Yeah, go ahead.
So I just try and say why I think the paradox of thrift is wrong in 2 minutes. Okay, so I think the paradox of thrift, if I've read it right, says that it's not possible for everyone to save.
Yeah, that's right. I guess the basic idea is that if you're saving, then you're reducing someone else's income somewhere else in the economy. So the more you withhold from spending money, the less money everyone else gets. So that's the paradox of thrift.
Okay, so if I can find one counterexample, even if it's really contrived, then I've disproved it, right? Okay, everybody has a seed potato and a bit of land. They grow out and grow a kilogram of potatoes each. Their net worth has gone up by 1 kilogram of potatoes each. Their savings have all increased. Now, if you're going to, that's it. That's my counterexample. If you're going to say, well, it's got to be more money, okay, then a bank prints a load of IOUs to buy up all those potatoes. Everybody's savings go up. No harm to the economy.
There you go. And that ties directly back into basic income, because if people are saving their money and they're not spending it, that means there's room to just add more money to the economy that people can spend to replace the so-called lost spending. And then the more money people save, the more money you can hand everyone else to spend, because the more room it creates in the economy for spending. What do you think about that?
It was a bit quick for me, but I'd have to think about it for a few minutes, but not convinced at the moment.
All right.
But I'm not against, in principle, basic income. I think let's just be realistic about it. I think if one group of people get to consume more, it must be because other people are producing more, or consuming less.
Or consuming less. Yep. Yeah. Okay. Great.
And that's a political matter, not economic.
We might say it's a very economic matter too. But regardless, thanks again for coming on, and thank you for sharing this model with us. I've been thinking a lot about how I visualize actions and transactions in the economy, and so it's interesting to see your take on it. This is helpful for getting the gears turning.
Yeah, this notation is really helping me visualize balance sheet changes much more intuitively. And I'm hoping that there's going to be an easy way to use it, because balance sheets, at least on a piece of paper, are really easy to draw. These arrows that have their specific colors, do I have to have like a set of markers out or something like that? I don't know, but I love in terms of how you've done it, it's very easy to read and easy to understand. So I would encourage anyone out there who's watching this or listening to this to go check out Chris's stuff, especially if you're doing any kind of thinking about the economy in terms of balance sheets. If you're taking Perry Merling's Money and Banking MOOC, this I think is a great kind of complement to that, this notation.
Okay, can I just quickly mention my my BitChute channel?
Yes.
Yeah, so that's just bitchute.com/E1L for economics in one lesson in the 21st century. And I've just set up a Discord server. Easiest way to get that is tinyurl.com/E1L Discord. E1L
Discord. Okay, fantastic. Well, thanks so much for coming on, Chris. This was a great discussion. It's been really fun looking at your stuff. Next week's topic, we're talking about functional approach to money, functional money. So this is going to be related to a paper that I recently wrote and gave a talk on at the symposium where we met Chris. So hopefully see people next week for that one. Thanks, guys.
Okay, thanks so much.
Thanks, Chris.